The Evil Within is underrated. Now, just calling something underrated isn't a particularly strong statement in itself, so I'll go a step further. The Evil Within is the greatest action game ever made. No, actually, I think I went a bit too far there. Okay, let's try again. The Evil Within is an action horror classic. Upon its release in late 2014, the game received a pretty polarising reaction from the critics, with the most common complaints being centred around unfair difficulty, buggy gameplay, and a weak plot. Now, I'm not out to try and counter every argument made by the critics of this game. I don't want the tone of this video to be too defensive. Rather, I want to showcase why I think The Evil Within is a classic of the action horror genre, up there, or nearly up there, with the likes of Dead Space and Resident Evil 4. That's not to say I'll be taking it totally easy on the game though. It does have its problems, but problems are weighted subjectively by the player. A game-breaking issue for one person might only be considered a minor irritant when experienced by another. The quality of the entire package should be considered when determining the weight and severity of any individual flaw. And that's especially important when appraising this game, because while this game does do a few things wrong, it also does a lot of things extremely well, particularly when it comes to exploration, level design, horror, and action. I've played through this game about half a dozen times over the past few years, and I always have a damn blast, every time. And while it certainly does have a lot of fans, I don't feel that it quite gets the credit that it deserves. And so, without another moment's delay, let me pull you into the visceral, violent nightmare that is The Evil Within. The Evil Within is not a game which takes its time in showing you what it's all about. You play as Sebastian Castellanos, a police detective based in the fictional location of Crimson City. Upon responding to a call of a disturbance at Beacon Mental Hospital, Sebastian and his partners Joseph and Kidman enter the building and come across a bloodbath, with the butchered corpses of staff and patients strewn everywhere. There only appears to be one survivor, the head doctor at the hospital, Dr. Jimenez, who seems thoroughly disoriented. Sebastian checks the security footage, seeing a hooded figure moving in ways which should be impossible, only to be attacked and knocked out by that same figure moments later. When he wakes back up, he is in a new reality altogether. Welcome to The Evil Within. Now let's get one thing out of the way. On your first playthrough of this game, you'll probably find it very difficult to understand quite what's happening. You'll fight your way through one location only to be abruptly pulled into a completely different one, only to return back to previous locations later on, all seemingly at random. You'll defeat a terrifying boss enemy and sigh with relief, only for that same creature to return alive and well later on, and at times, the very fabric of reality seems to be being actively remade in front of your eyes. Sebastian has been pulled into another world and is utterly confused by what's happening, and so should you be. The Evil Within makes it very clear early on that you should never get too comfortable, because one thing's for sure, wherever Sebastian has ended up, anything is now possible. Oh, getting a bit too comfortable in this old-timey village, eh? How about a level made out of massive mannequin heads? Or perhaps intestines? You get the picture. You're not in the normal world anymore. In fact, you might just be stuck in the mind of a psychopathic mass murderer. But we'll get to that. This is a game that is big on spectacle. Although the plot is something which you really need to work to understand by paying close attention to dialogue, text files and audio logs, don't expect any subtlety in any other areas. The action, enemies and set pieces are huge, violent and frantic. Throughout your journey you'll see huge skyscrapers sink to the ground, crazed chainsaw-wielding monsters, and enormous spiked traps. Dramatic, terrifying things are happening constantly, and you've got to fight tooth and claw to make it through unscathed. And trust me, you will be scathed plenty. Let's talk gameplay. The Evil Within is an action horror game through and through, and don't think that just because it's a horror game, that the action plays second fiddle. It doesn't. And conversely, the focus on frantic and violent action in no way detracts from the emphasis on horror. There are times where you'll be blasting away wave after wave of enemies with bullets and explosives. However, the game also doesn't shy away from those more quiet, creepy moments of thick horror atmosphere. If I had to compare it to any other game in terms of gameplay, I'd compare it to Resident Evil 4. This shouldn't be too controversial of a take, considering Shinji Mikami directed both titles. I'll make more specific comparisons to Resi 4 throughout this video, as there are many. The Evil Within is a third-person shooter, and like most third-person shooters, the two things you'll be doing most are shooting and navigating your way through the game's many levels and set pieces. In the same way that Resident Evil 4 didn't technically have any zombie enemies in it, the same applies to The Evil Within, with the most common enemies here being the haunted, crazed, mutilated humanoids. You'll be set upon by knives, hatchets, guns, dynamite and chainsaw, time and time again by these basic enemies, and although they may seem a bit generic at first glance, some of them have some pretty fucked up designs, if you'll pardon my French, and attention to detail. Any shooting game has its most common enemy, and it's very important to get these right, and to make them consistently enjoyable to kill. This is something The Evil Within understands well, and taking them out never stops being satisfying, probably because of how squishy they are. Just as Resident Evil 4 revelled in the visceral thrill of blowing an enemy's head off with a shotgun and rifle, The Evil Within carries on this legacy, encouraging the use of all manner of weapons to maim, freeze and burn the haunted. Waiting on someone getting nice and close and then blowing off half their body with your shotgun just as they're about to strike is cathartic as hell, and the game's sound enhances this to a massive degree. There are far more monstrous enemies than these regular guys though. The Evil Within isn't shy about throwing bosses at you, and that's where it really shows off its horror chops, because some of these designs here are just so fucking sick. They went wild with the animations on these things, and it's clear that the developers wanted to instill pure panic in the player when fighting some of these bosses, with some of them having the ability to insta-kill you in gruesome ways. It sounds kinda cheap, but it's not really. Just stay the fuck away from them, if you can. The game's weapon roster is quite basic for the most part, sporting classics like the handgun, shotgun and rifle, etc., each of which you'll obtain as you work your way through the game. An extremely fun additional weapon, however, and one which would thankfully return in the sequel, is the Agony crossbow. Like the handgun and the shotgun, you get this weapon quite early on, and it is a blast to use. It has a bunch of different ammo types for different situations. Sometimes you might feel like skewering an enemy onto a nearby wall. Other times you might be in a more freeze everything in sight and then shatter them into 1,000 pieces kind of mood. The choice is yours. Oh, and also please don't sleep on the flash bolts. They might sound kinda boring, but enemies are vulnerable to an insta-kill when stunned. You could actually argue that these are the most effective weapons in your arsenal, when you consider that you can easily clear out a room full of enemies with your knife after firing off a single flash bolt. While ammo for your more conventional arsenal of weapons is found dotted throughout the levels and via enemy drops, ammo for your Agony crossbow is primarily crafted through trap parts. Like a lot of gameplay elements in The Evil Within, traps are part of a prevailing theme tied to the plot, and you should always be on the lookout for them, even more so when playing on Nightmare difficulty. Although bear traps and wall-mounted proximity explosives are the most common variety, there are plenty of other more gruesome and disturbing types to be on the lookout for. As mentioned, keen-eyed players are rewarded for disarming traps with trap parts to make more ammo for their Agony crossbow. It is such a fun feeling when you are 2 inches away from activating a trap, only to notice it at the last second and get away completely unscathed. And now's the time where I have to talk about the game's best mechanic, and one that would sadly not return for The Evil Within 2. And that's fire. As we'll cover later, fire is very relevant to this game's story, so much so that a simple box of matches is one of the strongest tools in Sebastian's arsenal. When an enemy is downed, you have the choice of throwing a lit match on them, killing them outright. Yeah, these guys are flammable. They might briefly get up and run at you for a couple of seconds while on fire, but they're done. The thing is, this also works on surrounding enemies, meaning that you can down one enemy with a couple of shots to the leg and throw a lit match down just as other enemies are nearby, insta-killing a group of them all at once. This is such a fun mechanic, and you can save a ton of ammo doing this, especially seeing as how matches really aren't that rare at all. On my most recent playthrough I never ran out of them once. Just bear in mind that this could only be used on downed enemies. You can't chuck a match at any old dickhead who happens to be charging at you. It's a situational tool, but you'll get great results through smart usage. Sometimes its area of effect seems a bit inconsistent though. Although you can nail 4 kills with a well-timed match, other times you'll throw it down only for it to totally miss someone when you were sure it would hit. Some enemies will also thrash around on the ground when downed, making it a bit harder to get them. Let me reiterate though, that the match mechanic is great and does a lot to set this game apart from other shooters. I mentioned earlier that Sebastian could insta-kill stunned enemies with his knife, but the knife is also used for stealth kills. Stealth is actually an important part of this game, particularly in the first few chapters, although as you get to around the halfway point, it increasingly becomes unnecessary due to your expanding arsenal and associated weapon upgrades. At the beginning though, when ammo is especially scarce, your pistol is piss weak, and you can barely sprint for a full 2 seconds without keeling over, stealth is a necessity. Managing to clear out an entire area with only stealth kills is incredibly rewarding because the ammo you save to doing so really matters in this game. It's not just a matter of saving ammo either. The game is actually pretty hard, and if you can take out a few bad guys through stealth before the real action kicks in, it can be the difference between life and death. One kind of weak conclusion, however, is the ability to hide in closets or under beds. These interactions are quite prevalent in the first few chapters, but then the game kinda just forgets about them a bit, apart from in one particular chapter. Honestly though, I don't think I ever actually felt the need to make use of these in the early chapters. Usually if an enemy does spot you, it's better to just fight it there and then. The Evil Within also allows you to upgrade your weapons, just like in Resi 4. Instead of pesetas here though, your currency is green gel. Just as with ammo, you'll find green gel hidden throughout levels, in drawers, nooks and smashable boxes, as well as from enemy and boss drops. Your gel can be spent by fitting Sebastian into this bizarre brain machine thing, allowing you to upgrade nearly every aspect of every weapon, such as damage, crit chance, fire rate accuracy, ammo capacity, and many more. Upgrades for your Agony crossbow are particularly useful, and special bonus upgrades are available for some weapons upon their final upgrade. I always found it really rewarding to return to the save area with a big load of green gel to make my guns more powerful, and it provides a great sense of progression throughout the game. As well as upgrades for your weapons, Sebastian himself can be upgraded, things like his health bar and sprint duration. Well, I guess now's the time to talk about the sprint in this game. It's a piece of shit and I don't like it. Ugh, I'm exaggerating a bit, but yeah, it's not great. And it's also one of the most common complaints about the game, and it really is an odd design decision. Restrictive stamina meters are hardly an issue in most games, but Sebastian starts off absurdly small, and if you do happen to run for a bit too long, you're stuck in an infuriatingly long cooldown animation, regardless of whether or not you're currently being hunted by some unspeakable horror. Your sprint really matters in this game too. You'll often have to run to clear space from a group of enemies, and they can close that distance fast. Even after upgrading your sprint time a bit, it can still be an issue. Don't get me wrong though, by no means is it game breaking, not even close. It's mostly just a perplexing game design decision. While we're on the subject of common criticisms of the game, we should discuss another one, and that's weapon accuracy. Aiming in the Evil Within feels kinda weird. You'll notice it right away when you first get a hold of the handgun. I'm not entirely sure why it feels a bit off, maybe it's the way the camera zooms in from the side a bit. It doesn't necessarily feel bad, and you certainly do get used to it somewhat, but trying to aim often feels a bit harder than it should. This is made harder by the way the enemies move. They'll weave and lunge to try and make it harder for you to hit them and raise their hands to their faces. This is all fine though, nothing really wrong with that. What there absolutely is something wrong with is the way accuracy works. I mentioned earlier that accuracy can be upgraded for your guns. If you haven't played The Evil Within before, you might have wondered what exactly accuracy even means in this context. Surely accuracy is determined by the player's skill when aiming with the mouse or controller? Well, the thing is, in this game, just because you aim at something doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the bullet's going to go. Every now and then you'll aim at an enemy's head and fire, only to notice that the bullet goes off to the side, missing entirely. This can be annoying. This can be especially annoying when the enemy follows up with an attack and kills you, because the game decided it didn't want to allow you that shot. You'll probably encounter this most with the handgun, due to it being your most frequently used weapon. However, it becomes even more obnoxious when you miss a perfectly lined up headshot with a rifle or magnum, for which bullets are far more scarce. These misses don't happen constantly, but neither are they rare enough to be a non-issue. It's another really odd design choice, and it didn't work. The accuracy attribute shouldn't be a thing. It kinda reminds me of adaptability from Dark Souls 2. And while we are still on the subject of issues with the game, let me cap it off with one final one, and then we'll get on to some other shit, I promise. Sometimes when you get hit, it feels like you were done dirty. While most of the attacks employed by enemies are fairly conventional and avoidable through effective spacing, there are others that are far more frustrating to deal with. Sometimes you'll see someone lunge at you, and as soon as they're within your general hitbox, an animation will play of them stabbing down at you with their weapon. Once this animation is started, there's no getting out of it. There's no dodging away at the last instant as their weapon travels down. No, you just have to take the hit. It's essentially a grab attack that initiates without the part where you actually get grabbed. It's super frustrating when hit by these attacks, because some areas can be quite cramped, necessitating evasive manoeuvring by the player. But God forbid you're close to an enemy when they start this animation, because you're in it for the whole ride. It's another aspect of the combat which feels strange, but trust me, the combat does feel fantastic 90% of the time. While this is an action game, you'll never feel too comfortable with the amount of resources that you have. Every bullet really does count, and at several points in the game, you'll see just how quickly you can go from having nearly full ammo to being down to the last few bullets for your handgun. Because of this, you'll want to make sure you explore the levels extra thoroughly for resources and green gel, and the value of ammunition makes exploration feel especially meaningful and rewarding. A suite of different collectibles are also well hidden throughout each level, such as files, map pieces, newspapers and more. Some of these are challenging as hell to find, but nabbing them all is totally doable through diligent inspection of your surroundings. Don't expect to get them all in one playthrough though. A run through on New Game Plus will be required for sure. And finally, there's another incentive to search the hell out of every level, and that's the goddess statues. These white statues can be found in the darndest of places, hidden in out of place rooms, high up towers, or pretty much anywhere else. They can be shot or punched to yield a key which can be used to open lockers in the game's hub area. The contents of the lockers are randomised, but you'll typically be rewarded with large amounts of green gel, ammo and health items. Returning to the hub area to cash in on your keys and spend your gel on upgrades is satisfying as hell in the same way that it was to sell all your treasures in Resi 4 or your semiconductors in Dead Space. Now, as you've watched the various clips of gameplay on screen throughout this video, you'll probably have noticed how goddamn good this game looks. If this were to be released today, I'd be impressed as hell at the visuals and the style, but considering it's 8 years old now, they're simply outstanding. The variety of settings you'll traverse through on a playthrough is also great. Although your surroundings start off dark and drizzly, the game's not afraid to throw you into bright and sunny areas, and towards the end, into the epicentre of a collapsing city. The atmosphere and ambience is so thick in some of these locations, just begging the player to stop and stare. Just as the devs went all out on some of the boss designs, the same focus was paid to the levels. Things get very surreal at certain points too. And while some of the areas explored may not seem too fantastical, the game likes to throw in some weird shit every now and then, to remind you that you're not in the real world anymore. This is a very linear game, however, so don't expect to be left to explore many wide open areas. That'd come in the second game. But regardless of its linearity, the levels are a joy to both play through and look at. While we've gone through a few questionable game design decisions, the level design gets a straight 10 out of 10 from me. The pacing is fantastic and you're never left in the one type of location for too long. Now let's talk about what the fuck this game is actually all about. What the hell is going on?
What
Why are there monsters everywhere, and why has reality turned into a living nightmare for Sebastian and his comrades? I'll do my best to explain, and needless to say, there will be spoilers. It's all the result of the STEM system, a complex machine designed and created by Ruben Victoriano, better known as Ruvik. He's the hooded guy Sebastian spotted on the security cameras at the start of the game. STEM is a way for the minds of multiple people to be connected to the mind of one central person, allowing them to experience and explore that person's mental landscape. STEM was developed by Ruvik along with the help of Marcelo Jimenez, the doctor at Beacon Mental Hospital, who we also see at the start. The trouble is, Ruvik is an evil, psychopathic mastermind. As a child, he was known to conduct cruel and unethical experiments on animals. However, an incident which led to his sister Laura being burnt to death, also causing horrific burns all over his body, caused Ruvik to truly snap, completely discarding any remaining empathy and humanity. This incident is also the reason why fire is so effective in The Evil Within. It's what Ruvik fears most. Upon murdering his own parents, he inherits the Victoriano estate, using his family's wealth to develop STEM while being kept in supply of human experiments from Beacon Mental Hospital, courtesy of Dr. Jimenez. Years pass and Ruvik's experiments become more and more brutal, subjecting mental patients to torture and traps to elicit fear in them to aid in his research. And eventually Ruvik and Jimenez part ways after an argument.
Materials. Your research will very quickly disintegrate.
How dare you come into my home and threaten me?
I will briefly mention that there's also a third entity involved in this whole dynamic, a shadowy organisation called Mobius. No, not Morbius, Mobius. While Mobius is barely mentioned in the base game, it's far more of a focus in the DLC, and especially in The Evil Within 2. And so I'll leave that discussion for another day. Shit turns sour between Ruvik and Mobius and Jimenez, and so they kill him, and literally put his brain in the machine so that testing and research could continue. Remember I said that STEM allows for a central person to have their thoughts and memories explored? Yeah, well, turns out it also works with just someone's brain. Ruvik's brain was necessary for the continuing function of STEM due to a restriction that he himself put on it, but this backfired on Mobius, because Ruvik had one fucked up brain, it turns out. Everything Sebastian and his friends experience is a result of being trapped inside STEM. The reason it's all such a nightmarish hell world is because this is the very landscape of Ruvik's twisted mind. Ruvik has total power here, and he can mould and control this reality to his will. The haunted enemies you fight throughout the game are people who died while connected to STEM, or who gave into its mental assault. Anytime you see Joseph or Sebastian lose it during the game, is them struggling to fight off these effects. Those who give in turn to crazed people trapped inside Ruvik's consciousness. You can see this effect near the start in the lighthouse cutscene.
Hey, are you guys from around here? I don't know where...
Can't go.
As Sebastian fights his way through Ruvik's mind, he finds out that Ruvik desperately wants out of STEM, and that's where Leslie comes in. Leslie was a patient at Beacon Mental Hospital who lost his mind after his entire family were killed. For most of the game, we don't really know what Leslie's significance to the plot is. He mostly just comes across as a defenceless, sympathetic figure trapped in the same situation as us. However, we later find out that Ruvik intends to use Leslie as a vessel for his consciousness to allow him to escape STEM and make his way back into the real world. Someone who knew this all along was Kidman, who was actually an undercover agent working for Mobius. A scene where Kidman prepares to kill Leslie so that this doesn't come to pass leads to her attacking and killing Joseph instead, and then Leslie gets away. Unfortunately, Leslie eventually does reach Ruvik, and then this happens. Sebastian then defeats Ruvik in a dramatic final confrontation, and after escaping STEM, he squishes Ruvik's brain, thusly. As a traumatised and exhausted Sebastian finally exits the doors of Beacon Mental Hospital, for real this time. In the distance, he sees a familiar figure with a curious stride. Leslie? Or is that Ruvik? And that's the rundown of the plot of The Evil Within. There's a lot of details that I missed out regarding some important side characters who went missing in the real world and who play important roles in STEM. And also the way STEM itself works can get pretty confusing. It's also left kinda ambiguous at what point Sebastian and his comrades actually enter STEM in the first place. Was it after being drugged by Ruvik at the start, or did it start when they were driving to the hospital? I have to say too, I love Ruvik as a villain. He's really interesting. His story is dark and brutal, and yet there are also times when you actually feel sorry for him, especially when you realise his family were part of a strange cult when he was growing up, and also when you see the effect that the loss of his sister had on him. Sebastian himself as a main character is fine, but he's a bit wooden. There's actually very little focus on Sebastian's story in dialogue or cutscenes. Rather, you learn his backstory through text files throughout the game, discovering that he had a wife and child in the past. After his child allegedly burned to death in a house fire, his wife Myra couldn't accept this and was convinced that her child was still alive somewhere. Myra eventually goes missing herself, and Sebastian becomes an alcoholic. These events would all be explored far more thoroughly in The Evil Within 2, where they'd also changed the voice actor for Sebastian. I still kinda like the old ones though.
I do. I've seen it.
You don't understand what Ruvik is after.
So tell me, what is he after?
I saw more than a few negative reviews of this game, decrying its weak story, but I'm not quite sure I understand that. The plot can be confusing, yes, but I personally found it to be engrossing as hell. Even though it was often hard to tell exactly what was happening, I still wanted to know more. And while Ruvik at first glance has a wee bit of that hooded edgelord thing going on, as you learn more about him, you discover that he's actually quite a compelling and layered antagonist. The Evil Within is a banger of a game. With just a few small gameplay tweaks here and there, I think it would have been considered an instant classic upon release. Nonetheless, I truly would recommend it to any fans of modern Resident Evil, or action horror in general. It's the kind of game you'll want to jump straight back into after finishing it. The same way you unlock Professional mode after finishing Resi 4, Nightmare mode is unlocked in The Evil Within, and trust me, it's hard. Maybe just stay away from Akumu mode though. Thankfully, we'd also get a sequel a few years later, which was also fantastic, albeit with a fair few changes to the original. Maybe I'll do a video on that one too at some point. But yeah, do yourself a favour and pick this game up. You can usually get it on Steam for a few quid. Cheers for watching and cheerio.